Hey guys, I'm Norb.
And I'm Mike.
And we are The Watchmen.
The men who watch.
If it's on the screen, we're watching it, talking about it, and sharing our thoughts about it with you guys.
Today we are going back to the 80s yet again to discuss 5 awesome home arcade games. Not the games you played in the arcade, but the stuff we were playing at home.
So yeah, this will be, the 80s are always fun to jump back into. So looking forward to this bit of home, going back memory lane. But before we do that, I just want to say a quick shout out to all of you. Thank you for those of you who are watching our video here on YouTube. Please continue to do so and subscribe, and we appreciate your support. And for all of those who are listening on our podcast, thank you so much for doing that as well. And we hope you'll stick with us as we continue to do these shows. We appreciate your support. Now, as usual, Mike, why don't you get it kicked off?
Well, and as usual, before I get it kicked off, I got to talk a little bit about the generalities of that time. So, Norb, I want you to picture yourself in your living room with your Intellivision playing your games back in the 80s. And I'd like to know how it feels when you go back to that time and think about playing games in your home. Especially because I never had a console, so I never got to do that. So what was it like?
It definitely represents a special time in my life, especially with friends, my neighborhood buddies, especially Rob and Jim, who I probably played the most amount of time with on my Intellivision. But it actually started out, I really wanted to get an Atari because a lot of my friends already had Ataris. And so I played a lot of those fun games, Space Invaders, Combat, Missile Command, a ton of them. And I wanted an Atari myself. But instead, my dad did eventually get an Intellivision system, which I was still excited, even though it wasn't what I really wanted to get. Actually, to back up a little bit, where it first started was my dad said if you made it past the regionals in spelling bee in 6th grade, he would buy me an Atari. And I got to the regionals, and then I ended up losing, and I spelled the word abbreviate wrong, and I was knocked out of the final 5, which I needed to make to get the game system. So I was not only sad for blowing it on a word that I should have gotten, but I saw my Atari dreams melting away at this point. I was one spot away, but fortunately my dad felt sorry for me anyway and thought I did well enough to still deserve something, but he got me then the Intellivision after that. So it wasn't the Atari, but then I quickly became in love with playing the Intellivision, and we got a whole bunch of games, and that started off a very fun, just lots of memories of late 6th grade and then throughout junior high of playing the Intellivision with friends. And a lot of my lists of these home video games are definitely from this console that I owned and played for many, 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 many years and hours per day.
It was kind of similar in my home to a point. I wanted an Atari just as bad as you, and I pleaded with my parents, could you please get me an Atari? That's like everything I could dream of, is being able to play video games at home where I don't have to have quarters and I can play as long as I want and I don't have to be in an arcade. I pleaded and pleaded. And at some point they probably had that talk, where mom said, well, Vance, do you think we should get him one? And my dad said, oh. And at some point the answer was no.
You didn't get the happy ending that I did.
So I was never given an Atari, not for a Christmas present, not for a birthday present, not for nothing. And to this day, it's one of the tough memories I have to live with, of that I didn't have that experience. My friends in the neighborhood had one, and occasionally I get to go over to their house and play. But the tough thing too with that is, whenever I get to go to play, they'd already been playing those games over and over. So they were somewhat bored of them too.
Oh, yeah.
So they'd indulge me for a little bit, we'd play, and then they'd be bored, or they'd already have played it 3 hours earlier in the day. And so when Mike shows up, it's like, okay, let Mike play a couple games. And so again, my time was limited. I even have a memory of when I went to Wenatchee, to visit my grandparents. I think I was just talking about how much I wished I had an Atari, and how bad I dreamed that I could play. And or my grandma says, well, your cousin has an Atari. And of course I'm like, can we go over to his house? Can we go over to his house? Can we go over to his house? Well, they took me over and he had one and we played Asteroids in the basement. And I remember just walking into the basement and seeing the two controllers, seeing it just on the floor with the TV on the TV tray. And it was like, finally, I had that chance. And what's really funny is I ran into that cousin a couple summers ago. We visited him. He and his family were at a campground with other family. We went and saw him. And I went up to him and I gave him this heartfelt story of what it meant to me to be able to go to his house and play that Atari. And he had no memory of that.
That's funny. That does happen sometimes where you might have a complete different experience or memory of the same moment that somebody shared with, and they remember it completely different or don't remember it at all. But obviously in your mind, they had the Atari, so it wasn't like a rare opportunity for them. It was just one more day of playing an Atari amongst many years. For you, it was like the one time, it was right there. So it's pretty funny that.
And there's something to be said about when you want what you don't have, but when you have it, then it's kind of not special anymore. And eventually, it can get boring or can get old. And I never went through that part of the journey. So right. I always still wanted what I couldn't have. And so anytime I got to go to anyone's house at an Atari, it was precious time. Even though looking back, the graphics on that Atari 2600 were pretty darn crusty. And I think you were fortunate to have an Intellivision because you did have better graphics.
Well, and I kind of started buying into the ads because I didn't really know that much about the Intellivision because I just knew about the games my friends were playing and they all had Ataris. And so I started seeing the ads with George Plimpton talking about Atari versus Intellivision, and television is the supreme console or whatever. I can't remember what the tagline was, but they would compare Atari side by side with Intellivision, and the graphics were definitely better, especially when it came to the sports games. Yeah. Intellivision had a definite edge on Atari, and I started kind of buying into it. I was like, yeah, that's right, Intellivision is way better.
They say, this is Atari football, and you see three dudes all linked together like this, moving around. This is Intellivision, and the guys are all separate, passing, running, and it's clear that Intellivision was way better. I just think their controllers were so weird.
The controllers, I wish I had one to show you. The controllers were probably the most complicated controller ever created. It had 4 buttons on the side, this disc which you pushed down, but it was very not real intuitive, and then like a phone keypad on the front. So you had all these different buttons which allowed for much more interactivity during the game. But my friends struggled. They could not perform on it like I could. So it definitely was a distinct advantage. Once I realized how to work your fingers and get the maximum response on making that controller work for you, I became really good at it and got really good at not having to look at it. Most of my friends have to look, and by the time they looked, they were dead. For me, I could just blindly feel my way through, like a expert typist on the computer. So I had a definite advantage there, but it was unique. I don't think any other controller had quite so many buttons.
Well, I think people were just used to the joystick.
Yeah,
joysticks were common on arcade games, and the Atari 2600 had a joystick. Yep. So Intellivision is like, where's the joystick? What's this disc thing?
Yeah, that's right.
Disc thing. What do I do with this?
Yeah, the arcades had discs and triggers and things like that, and this was definitely ahead of its time. The controllers now have definitely become more like that. You have more thumb pushing down of things, but that was ahead of its time for sure. And not everybody could handle it. So
it even had the inserts for every game. Had its own little insert you would push in over the buttons.
It did.
So the buttons would become kind of unique to the game.
Yeah, it was. So again, you imagine a telephone keypad where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way to 9 and a 0 and a star and a pound key. That was essentially what was on the front. And every game had little plastic inserts that you would cover, that you slide in, and it would have certain functions that each of those buttons would be assigned to. It was a very ingenious way to make it to where you could get lots of different things you could do at the touch of your thumbs, but it was a little bit cumbersome for a lot of people. I had to mention, crossing over to one of our past shows, we talked about shows we were watching on television or streaming, and you had brought up The Americans as a show that you really liked, and thanks to you, I know my sister started watching that show, and I started watching it. I'm now into season 2. About halfway through season 2. I'm definitely hooked now, and it's definitely a good show if you're looking for something to get into. It's a very good spy kind of suspense thriller type of show. But what's kind of fun is the son of the main couple characters. He was about my age, I guess, at that time. This was, it takes place in the 80s, around that time, and he is constantly asking his parents for an Intellivision. So I'm like, yeah, Intellivision, baby. That's right. That's where it's at. So it's pretty cool that they have even that mentioned in the show. So I thought that was just added that much more appreciation for the Americans, the fact that they had a Intellivision mentioned in the show repeatedly.
Well, the Americans even gets deeper than that, which I'm going to bring up later in our show.
Ooh, okay. All right.
It won't be a spoiler either, so it won't ruin anything for you.
Okay, well, good. More things to look forward to.
And actually, that means next week, I look forward to you telling me you've gotten into Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the way this pattern's going.
Yeah, let's not push our luck here. I'll give you the Americans. We'll start with that one.
Well, the day you get into Star Trek Deep Space Nine will be the day that you-know-what freezes over.
If every show on Netflix and every streaming channel suddenly went dark and Deep Space Nine was the only thing available, I might give it a try then. So.
All right. Well, along the lines of what we talked about with the Atari 2600, the fact that I never have one, my parents weren't all that bad. So what they did allow me to do is my dad taught computer programming and math at Seattle High School, and he was really the pioneer of bringing in computers into the school. And so he talked them into investing into about 4 Apple II computers. And a funny story my dad has told is he remembered the principal coming into his office one time and said, Vince, so this computer thing, he said, are these things a fad? Are they a fad? I need to know if we're going to be spending money on this kind of stuff. And my dad said, Lynn, it's not a fad. It's funny. The future. So
you had Apple IIs.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. There were 4 Apple II computers just in the math department outside my dad's office. They kind of set up a little area where they had 4 cubicles, and each cubicle had an Apple II machine. And Dad would let me play games on them. And he was even super nice when I hit around 13 years old. He would even let me during the summer ride my bike down the hill and let myself into the math room with his keys. And he taught me how to disable the alarm system. And he'd let me play games by myself. And
nice.
So I got very good at Apple II computer games, which is one reason there's a lot of them on my list today. So that was a great memory. Probably the only sad memory about that, Norb, is that I have so many good memories of going in there and playing games by myself. But the key word there is myself. I played alone.
In by yourself, yeah.
I never got to share so many of these experiences of playing these games with others. They were just, right. In fact, I will talk a little bit about that when I get into a few of them. But that's another thing I think, why I wish I had an Atari is I feel like friends would have come over and we would have had that friends gaming experience that you had with your friends. All my gaming experiences were alone, by myself.
That is pretty sad. I feel for you, man. Because, a lot of my childhood memories are memories of Rob coming over, playing games. I remember looking forward to Jim walking down the street. I'd be looking out the window and see him sauntering down the street in that very casual way that he does and in no hurry. And I knew that when he gets here, it's showtime. We're going to be playing some games. It's going to get fierce and competitive because Jim by far was the best friend who was good at Intellivision. He and I got to a level where we were pretty much equals, and a lot of these games became very intense and the competitions were great. And so the memories of that, and then the times I would go to Rob's house to play the Atari, or another friend Jason, or Scott, they also had a Atari 2600. So lots of sleepovers and late nights playing those games. So it's too bad you missed out on those experiences, but
I have great memories, but at least I can share them with you today. So in a way, then I wasn't alone. Now others were kind of there with me.
Yeah. Well, I have to, before you jump in there, you mentioned the Apple II. I also had, not really the gaming side, but my first computer class, I remember, was in high school, and I think they had Apple IIe computers. And we learned basic programming, and one memory from that, we didn't play games. I don't think we were allowed to. But one thing I did do was, I hacked our didn't really hack it. I just sort of simulated. Every computer had a login screen, and you had to put in your password and all that stuff. And I made it to where I created this basic thing. I faked the login screen, so when you typed something, it would create this really annoying high-pitched whine sound, and you can't tell what's going on because it just makes this really loud, annoying. Just it's like dog whistle piercing sound. And I'd loaded that on a bunch of people's computers before class one day, so the whole class was filled with this ear-piercing whine sound, and I think I got in trouble for doing that, but it was kind of fun. I felt like Matthew Broderick in War Games, hacking into the system.
I know, that was my extent of basic computer programming. Is Dad taught me how to program in BASIC. So you'd BASIC would have lines where every line had a number. So you'd have line 10, input, what is your name, ? Line 20, name equals $. So you would assign your name to a variable, and then you could say step 30, print $. Very basic stuff, but that was the beginning of computer programming. And you'd have 10, 20, 30 because you might have to go back and insert lines in between lines. And if you went 1, 2, 3, you were kind of messed up there. Couldn't do it. So I had fun learning how to make little programs, but I could never program really great games. So
I didn't have an Apple at home, but I had a TRS-80 Trash 80 Radio Shack color computer, and I learned how to type on that thing, and I learned BASIC. I taught myself BASIC on that program.
You must have had a Tandy good time.
It was a Tandy printer with a Tandy good time to go with it. But I actually made several games. Probably my best game I made on there was a game called Tordon, and it was kind of like Defender a little bit, where you had a little guy who you're defending your wall, and you had one little vulnerable niche in it, and you had to shoot incoming aliens who are trying to land in that hole. So your job was to go in and shoot them. And it moved very blocky. It was super slow. Basically, it was really slow. So it was like, and you try to shoot it. But it worked. There was no sound effects, just these guys moving. And if they zapped you or got through to the hole, then your game was over. But you tried to score points. And I was actually proud of that. I made my own video game back in 1982 using BASIC. So unfortunately, I have no proof of it. I can't show my kids that I made a video game. I have no pictures, no video. I should have taken some, but I did make one back on the Trash 80 TRS-80 color computer by Tandy using BASIC language. So that was my video gaming creation days way back in the early 80s, inspired by playing Intellivision games and arcade games and such. So
you had everything, man. You had the Intellivision, you had the Trash 80, you had both worlds. I had one world, so good for you.
Yeah, I had both worlds. I spent a lot of time on that computer. I remember my friends were giving me a hard time because they wanted to go out hang out, and I was nerding out, being on the computer, learning programming and stuff. So
trying to break into the military defense system.
Well, unfortunately, I wish we didn't have any modem or anything like that. Yeah. It was all just stuff inside the house, but it was fun. But let's get into this list. I want to hear the games now. I'm excited to play these games.
I picked games. They all have stories associated with them, especially back then. And so along the lines of the Apple II, when my dad set up the 4 Apple II machines, he had a rule with the high school kids because they wanted to play games too. And of course, they were all networked with other high school kids in nearby towns, and so they'd share games. They figured out how to crack games. They had it's funny, as in the early days, just when there were new games to play, there were new ways to rip them off. So they would learn how to copy and even circumvent copy protection. They were very, very savvy. But Dad would allow game playing on Friday. So I started to see what kind of games I could play in the Apple II because the high school kids were getting a hold of them. And there was a game they got a hold of called Choplifter. And Choplifter is actually not the game on my list, but it's a segue into the game that is very important to me on my list. But Choplifter was a cool game. You played as a helicopter, and you would have to rescue guys running out in a military land, and there were tanks that would shoot you. But I remember if you landed on the guys, they died. These little stick figures kind of went, they kind of keeled over. So it was even your first dose of just, it's a video game violence, death, stick figures dying. So you pick up the guys, take them back to base, and get points. But I really like that game. And, I was thinking back to what led into me getting the game I'm going to talk about. But I can't remember why. I think Choplifter must have been spread across a couple discs because there was some reason they couldn't give me a copy of it so I could play it by myself. So I saved up about $30. My dad said it's about $30 to buy Choplifter, buy the game. So I saved my allowance, and my dad took me down to the computer store in Yakima called Cliff Miller's Computers. And I had my $1 bills all wadded up, and we went in, and my dad introduced me to the sales guy who knew him because he'd sold him the computers for the school. And I said to him, I want to buy Choplifter. And he said, I remember he put his finger up. He said, well, that's great, Mike. He said, but you know what? We just got a new game who's made similarly by the same company that I think you'll like even more. It's called Lode Runner. So he took me over to this screen and he said, okay. He says, let's put in Lode Runner. So Lode Runner was created by a guy named Douglas Smith, who actually created this game in Renton, Washington, believe it or not, Norb.
Wow, my current hometown now.
Yep. So you're sitting amongst greatness, and you had no idea.
Yeah.
So Lode Runner, he showed me this, and it's a platform game where you're this guy and this little stick figure guy, and you have to run the levels. So the levels are connected by ladders and tight ropes, and there are little things of gold, like little gold barrels, and you have to pick them up. And when you collect all the gold barrels, a secret ladder appears to take you to the top of the screen, which is going to the next level. But there were bad guys chasing you, and you could dig holes. So instead of having a gun to shoot them, you just had a hole digger. So you could dig a hole and they'd fall in it. And if they were carrying gold, they'd drop the gold. And you could then, if the hole closed up, they would die and resurrect at the top. So it was a chase type platform game. You're constantly being chased by the bad guys, but trying to get the gold and move on. But I watched this little stick guy run around. I remember he went up the ladders and he swung across tight ropes. So cool. And in a second, I was like, I want that. I want that. So yeah. I bought it. And $30. And the best thing about Lode Runner is that it had a level editor where you could design your own levels. So there were 150 levels. And the story is that Doug Smith in Renton, Washington, got the neighbor kids to design levels for him, and he paid them $0.25 per level. So they were all into what he was doing because he was working on this in his garage, believe it or not, in Renton. Wow. So the game came with 150 levels, but most of those levels, I think, were designed by his neighbor kids. Wow, so they helped him out. But he made a level editor. So not only could I play the game, I could make my own levels. And I got creative. I made levels out of my name, spelled out of bricks. The saddest part of that is that I don't have them. Kind of like you not having your program. I wish I could see what my brain was creating at the time.
Even just to take some screen pictures. But there was no easy way to take pictures back then. You either had to use up expensive film. There wasn't no cell phone. We could just quickly take a shot. But we could have done it. We just didn't think about it at the time. It didn't seem like a big deal. But now you look back, I wish I had proof of cool stuff like that.
So Lode Runner is something you can even play today, though. They have it on Steam, and what's really neat is they made a new 3D version of Lode Runner, but within the game you can unlock classic Lode Runner, which is the stick figure Lode Runner I grew up playing. So if you're curious about Lode Runner, just go on Steam. You can purchase the game. It's under $10 and have that experience. And Lode Runner has had many iterations over the years, so it has been something that has evolved over time, and people play it even today.
I think what's amazing is when the story of you going down with your $30 to buy the game that was back in early 80s. And video games, for the most part, haven't really changed that much in price. They're more like between 30 and 60 or so. But for inflation's sake, that's really not that much of a price jump compared to you're paying $30. I mean, that's a lot of money back then.
Yeah, back then
it was hard to get $30 because minimum wage, all those jobs didn't pay very much money. So that was a big sacrifice to choose what game you were going to buy.
I remember the high school kids at one point, they ignored me for the most part. I was just a stupid little kid. But I remember after I had Lode Runner, I remember one of them came up to me and he said, "Hey, Mike, is there any chance we could borrow your Lode Runner disc? We have a crack program that we'd like to try to crack it." And of course I said, sure. I was like, wow, these high school kids are actually acknowledging that I'm a person and I have a name and they're asking me for something. So I let them borrow it and I think they cracked it. So I didn't mind. I was glad that they thought I was cool enough to ask.
So you became cool because you helped them with their illegal activities.
Exactly.
So, good job.
So there you have it, Lode Runner.
So
check it out.
All right. Well, so for me, almost every game on my list is going to be an Intellivision game. And I would have to start with the game Dungeons and Dragons, inspired by the adventure card game, which I never played at all. But Mattel Electronics, who made the Intellivision, adapted their own version. And this is a game definitely, my friend Jim, he'll come up in pretty much in every game that I talk about here, but that was one where we actually played together because it was really a one-player game. And I remember you start in the bottom left corner, and you have to work your way through this map to get to the like a volcano or a mountain or something, and that's where the final maze is, where you have to defeat the dragon. So along the way, you run through these mazes. And what was cool about it is it was one of the first games I remember where it was a scroller game. So you're in the middle, and the world, you could go up, down, left, and right. And as you moved, the camera would pan with you and reveal different parts of the tunnel you're in. So it's a tunnel type game. So as you're moving, the camera would reveal more of the maze as you're going towards it. So you never really know what's lurking around every corner, which made it exciting and a little bit nerve-wracking, because you would hear, for example, you'd run into different creatures. There'd be goblins, snakes, ultimately the dragons, spiders, things like that. I think a rat as well. And so if you enter into a chamber, you never know what's going to be waiting for you in there. But sometimes you'll know. They'll give you sound effects, like there'll be a snake hissing. So you know there's a snake lurking nearby, and as soon as you go into that room, it might be right there, and then it suddenly reveals itself. And then you got to run, and you got your arrows, and you try to shoot it and take it down. So it was a fun game. We would team up on that and control the one guy, but one of us would, like we normally would do, one of us would control the player, and the other one would do the shooting. And it worked out well. So it was a fun team-up game controlling one guy, and I liked it because it was just one of the few games that actually created some suspense and fear, because it was one of those first games where you really had that sense of not being able to know what was coming around the corner. You know, it was very unique in that way. So that was a fun one. Eventually we did get to the end and defeat the dragon, which was very scary when that would happen. And you have to go running and try to escape and then shoot him and run some more. And there's a lot of screaming and yelling and freaking out during that game. And definitely some good memories. So Intellivision game, first one on my list, Dungeons and Dragons with my buddy Jim. If you're listening,
I'm trying to imagine calm, cool, collected Jim, who's usually pretty methodical in his thinking, screaming and yelling.
Well, maybe I did all the screaming. Jim was probably pretty quiet, or else cursing at me for messing up. But yeah, for the most part, he actually probably didn't do much of the screaming. I think I did most of the screaming on that game. But yep, lots of fun in our basement. That's where, in my parents' basement, that's where most of these games were played. Many times downstairs after school.
All right, well, my next game on my list is also an Apple II game that I played a lot by myself, and it was called Castle Wolfenstein.
Oh, yes.
Castle Wolfenstein is a stealth-based action-adventure shooter video game developed by Muse Software for the Apple II. It was released in 1981 and ported to MS-DOS, the Atari 8-bit family, and the Commodore 64. An Allied spy has been captured and taken to Castle Wolfenstein for interrogation by the SS and is subsequently thrown into the dungeon. A dying prisoner emerges from a hiding place and in his last moments hands the spy a fully loaded Mauser C96 pistol. The spy proceeds to escape the dungeon, steal the battle plans from the officer's headquarters, and leave Castle Wolfenstein. With an emphasis on trying to avoid detection for as long as possible, Castle Wolfenstein and its sequel are considered by gamers to be prototypical stealth-based games. Some of the first in a genre that would not gain popularity until the late 90s. So, in Castle Wolfenstein, you're obviously the prisoner. And it was one of those games that it was hard. If you got shot or arrested by the SS, the game was over. And this is a 60-level game. There's 60 rooms you have to work your way through. So if you're caught, you got to start over. There's no 3 guys, no second chance.
There's no saving your game and moving on. Oh, man, that's rough.
Start over.
Jeez.
Kids today, I try to tell them, you don't know idea how hard it was back then. If we died,
you had to get good.
We started over, and you had to just get good. And I did get good at this game. And I remember it to this day. I was by myself alone in the Apple computer lab, and I remember I died a lot. But I finally found a door I'd missed, and I got into a room that I could tell was the right way out. And I got killed, but I remember at that moment, I thought, I know how to get out. So I started over, and I did. I got out, and I remember the moment you go out the last door, and it draws this picture of a drawbridge with a castle on the left, and you're standing at the far end of the drawbridge, and the words, "You escaped," are at the top.
Whoa.
And that was it. So I sat by myself, and there was no one to pat me on the back or say, "Wow, you did it!" I remember I just stared at the screen. I thought, I did it. I escaped, and that's it. The game was over. There's no high scoreboard or no posting to the online leaderboards and the time it took you to do it. It was just you escaped, and I beat the game, as we call it. So that was my Castle Wolfenstein.
That's pretty cool. That's funny. I didn't know that was going to be on your list. And I actually have my own experience with Castle Wolfenstein. Is it Wolfenstein or Wolfenstein? Wolfenstein, right?
That's a good question. I think it's Wolfenstein. I think it's Wolfenstein.
So I never played the old version. I knew the name, but never played it then. But I played it when it became you mentioned about the late 90s, and I think early 2000s, they released it as a first-person shooter on PC. And I actually got into it. I think it was called Return to Castle Wolfenstein, I think. But I love that game. There was a time I was really into it. I was playing it all the time. And what was cool about that, you could play a soldier, you could play a medic, you could play a explosives expert. So depending on the mission, you'd have a different role. Sometimes your job is as a medic, you just fix the guys who are shot. If you're a soldier, you got to go up there and blow away the enemy. Or if you're the explosive guy, you obviously got to set bombs and do all this kind of stuff. And I feel like it's been ages. I can't remember. I remember just very vague images of playing that game, but I remember many hours of playing it and enjoying it, struggling, because I never got to the end, I don't think. But that was so much fun. And that was that time when it was just starting to get into, first-person shooters on PC were just kind of everything. It started with Doom, and then Dark Forces and Jedi Knight, and then Castle Wolfenstein rolled in there as well. So for myself, I had a point in my life where Castle Wolfenstein brought many hours of joy to me by myself. That was when I was by myself time playing that game. And so you had the old one and I had the newer one.
The other funny story about the Castle Wolfenstein game on the Apple II was the sound was pretty primitive on the Apple II computer. It wasn't like the arcades. Most games were bleep, bloop, 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 bleeps and bloops. Occasionally that of an explosion. It was like that. But the guy who made this game, he figured out how to try to create some speech. I don't know how he did it. But when if you'd get into a room and there'd be an SS trooper, he'd be marching back and forth. But if he'd see you, he'd go, SS! It was like SS, but but you could make it out. I think your brain helped fill in the gaps. But you had a gun, and if you shot him, he would go. It was like a really big scream, and it was kind of scary. Remember, it was because it was loud, and it was just a
in that 8-bit quality.
Yeah,
with all the digital noise artifacts. But
yep,
probably it's part of the charm on the creepiness because it was so distorted sounding, right?
Yeah,
it probably made it part of it why it was scary too.
It definitely made it creepy. So funny memory. All right, what's your next one?
Okay, so now I got to move into my other Mattel Electronics Intellivision game, and probably the one that we talked about that put them on the map in terms of really edging out Atari, and that was football, NFL football. And this was the first football game I'd ever gotten into because I didn't play the football games in the arcade. I didn't really play the ones on Atari because they were so bad, but I really got into this. And this was definitely, I played a lot with my friend Scott up the street had the Intellivision first, so I remember first seeing this game. It was the very first game I ever saw, and I was like, wow, that's really cool. They're running, and you can pass the ball. And so Scott and I would play, and Rob played, but Jim became the one who could most try to challenge me on that one. I think I was always a little bit better than him when it came to this game. But one thing that was unique about this is, and that really applies to all the sports games, was that one, you always had they had just a really good cycle of a person running. So that body, that little pixelated guy, but it would run very smoothly. But everybody did. Every athlete in a game in all the sports games looked like that. But
they had long arms and legs.
Long arms and legs, and what was cool though is you could run the ball and you could pass the ball, and you could actually pick different formations. So, I remember if you want to run the ball, you hit the 7 button on the keypad, and then a formation. If you're going to pass it, you hit the 9. 9 means pass. Then you pick a formation. You choose your receiver. It was very complicated. Again, my friends would have the playbook out, and they're like, okay, 9, and what's the formation? It was very slow, but. It was great. So you could pass the ball and it played like a real game. This is before teams, so there was no. It was you were red or blue. That was it. But there were no teams. There was no logos. They didn't have the resolution anyway. But the cool thing was, again, a common fixture in any game that had the sports involved. They had this unique cheering sound. The audience ambience, and it was made up of just digital noise, so it just kind of sounded like. But
when you hear the
but then they put that sound of a person whistling, like
yes.
But it was very, very digital sounding. And so it was bad as like Gilligan's Island. Canned laughter in the background, but it was just part of the experience. But the thing about that game, and really for all the sports games, is they played it out like a real game. You couldn't change the length. So every quarter was 15 minutes. Every play would stop on an incomplete pass. It would take like 3 hours to do a game from start to finish because everything ran by the book. So there was no fast game that you can just do in 5 minutes. If you wanted to finish the game, you had to play for several hours like a real NFL game, and it was not a quick process. So
what did you do when in the middle of the game you'd hear mom say, "Norb, come to dinner"?
We'd have a lot of unfinished games because that window of time between getting home after school and by the time my dad got home, and there was a lot of times when my friends would have to sneak out because sometimes my dad would come home, and if he didn't have a great day or he catches us playing video games, he wouldn't always be too thrilled. So there was some times
wasting your time.
Wasting my time. I should be doing some other more productive things. And sometimes the guys would try to sneak out the back door if we hear the garage door open. My dad's home. Go, go, go. And I think one time my dad caught my friends running out, and I got big trouble for that. But aside from that, it was great experiences. So NFL football was awesome. And Jim, I think I beat you more often than you beat me. So pretty sure about that. But good times. Lots of good times. In fact, when I made a video of my other friend, Rob. We have actually an Intellivision football fight video where we start the movie off and I end up scoring a touchdown on him, and we get into this big fight, and the whole video from that point on is us just beating the crap out of each other because of this Intellivision game that I beat him in. So it inspired many creative things, including fights. So lots of fun.
That's cool.
Intellivision football. Yeah.
So the third game on my list, it's the last in the Apple II era, but it's a game called Sabotage, and it also is known as a name called Paratrooper. It was written by Mark Allen. The player controls a gun turret at the bottom of the screen by either keyboard, paddle control, or a joystick. The turret can swivel to cover a large area of the screen, but cannot move from its base. Helicopters fly across the screen at varying heights, progressively lower over time, dropping paratroopers, hence the name Paratrooper. Waves consist of helicopters coming at progressively lower altitudes, a brief rest, and then a wave of jets that drop bombs. So the interesting part of this game, and this is the only game on the Apple computers, Norb, that my dad and the other math teacher, Mr. Archer, got into playing. They didn't care much for the games. They were just about the math program, but they liked this game, and I know why. It was an interesting design because you got points for shooting the paratroopers, the jets, or the helicopters, but every time you fired a bullet, it cost you a point. So to get a high score, you had to learn how to conserve ammo, and you had to get very good with your shots because every time you fired a bullet, a point was deducted from your score. And I think being math people, they liked that give and take of the math of the game.
You have to be efficient.
Yeah. So I enjoyed the game too. It was fun because the paratroopers, these little dudes, they'd float down, and if you hit their chute, they'd fall. So if you hit them, they just exploded into little bits of pixels. But if you hit the chute, they'd fall, and when they'd hit the ground, there'd be this sound, and there'd be little red splotchy things that would move across like blood. So it was like another video game, early days of video game violence right there.
Did it have kind of a Space Invaders or Missile Commandish feel? The coming in from the top that you had to shoot down? That's kind of the concept?
It's just just imagine you got a single turret gun that just moves left and right in the center of the screen with no shields or anything. But then helicopters fly overhead and drop paratroopers, so you can shoot the choppers or the paratroopers drop down. But they're just little guys with parachutes, so it's not really like the Space Invaders, and that they're marching their way down. It's really they're just floating down on parachutes, and you got to keep shooting them, because if they land, when you get 6 guys on one side, all of a sudden the game's over. They march their way over to your turret, and they make a little stairway out of dudes, and the last dude jumps up on your turret, and your turret blows up. So the game is over. So but as you continue to watch the Americans, once time moves on to where the Intellivision moves into a personal computer, there's a shot of the kid playing Sabotage.
Ooh. Oh, nice.
And I remember seeing that. I thought, wow, those guys went deep, because not many people know the game Sabotage. That is just not something. So I think
they get an Intellivision and at some point upgrade to an Apple II.
It's not an Apple II. I think it's a Commodore 64.
Oh, okay.
So, but he's playing Sabotage on it, and it's just a quick shot. But right away, I was like, he's playing Sabotage. Wow, somebody really had to know their games to even use that as the game he's playing.
Now you got to tell me, you won't be spoiling it. Well, maybe you would be, but you got to let me down now if that's going to be the case. But do they ever get the Intellivision, or will I ever get the joy of seeing some gameplay?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, I'll keep watching then.
You asked, so I answered.
Well, I would really disappoint if they never got one. At least now I'll have to look. I'm going to be looking forward to that day the Intellivision game makes an appearance.
Yeah, the game I remember seeing him play was Astro Smash.
I was going to mention Astro Smash.
That's the one that he's playing.
Oh God, of all the games, that's a lame one.
It's probably because it's a space shooter, so people who don't know Intellivision can easily just see something shooting things at the screen. I think it's just,
plus it fits with the whole idea of, at the time, part of the thing is the Cold War and the missile defense system, and in this case they're defending the planet from these incoming things. I guess there's a tie into that. But yeah, Astro Smash was like the weak version of Missile Command or Space Invaders.
Did you have it
together? I feel like I did. It got boring pretty quick, though.
Yeah, I could see that.
It was one of those games where I was like, this is good for like 5 minutes. Then
I can see that.
Not that great. Yeah. Anyway, was that it?
Yep, that's it.
Paratrooper? All right. Okay, so my next one is another sports game in the Intellivision Electronics lineup, and that would be baseball. And I was gonna say, you're gonna have to work the sample in on the edit on this one, because it deserves a special part. So most of the time there was not a lot of, we talked about the sound, and there's always sound effects. I talked about the crowd, and there's always bleeps and bangs and stuff, but it's hard to do voices. The Intellivision did come out with a voice module with special IntelliVoice games, and it had talking on there, like B-17 Bomber and Bandit 9 o'clock, and it was pretty good. But this was before this game.
Kind of sound like Jimmy Stewart there.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I guess a digital 8-bit version.
IntelliVoice with Jimmy Stewart.
It had a little southern drawl to it. It was pretty good. But this baseball game came out before the IntelliVoice. But they managed to work out a voice in the game. So anytime, as the premise of the game is very basic. Again, blue team versus red team. No major league teams represented here. But you played with. You see the whole field at once, and you had the 9 defenders. If you're on defense, you control the pitcher, and you can either throw a slow ball or a fastball, and you can kind of curve it to the right, curve it to the left. And as a hitter, you got either bunt or swing, and then once the ball's out there, you got to quickly hit that pad and try to activate the player, get it, and try to get the person out. What's funny about this game was, because there's no 3 dimensions, there was no way to differentiate a fly ball versus a ground ball.
Yeah, I can see that.
So the ball is just traveling, and as long as the ball gets from here to the outfield, at any point if it's grabbed, there's no fly ball. Everything's basically like
it's like they're playing in a 2-dimensional world.
Yeah. So because of that, any ball is sort of live. So what's funny about that, and again, this is probably a game that when it came to perfect opponents, Jim and I got so good at this game, you couldn't get any better. we mastered this game to where, unlike sports games today, you'll always have some element of, you might have a better roster, or your player, the team you have has better, variables that make them better hitters. In this game,
just randomness.
Simple. Yeah, in this game, it's completely, you just mastered the controls, and it's all about who's going to be better and who has a little bit of luck on their side. And so it was back and forth, and we were as perfectly matched as can be. But what's funny about that game, there could be times when you could hit a ball and it could be a little trickler. And if it somehow manages to hit the edge of the screen, there's a chance that little, what looks like a little rolling bunt, could turn into a home run. Just if the computer decided that ball was a home run, even though it's moving at like 2 miles an hour, if you didn't get there in time, it could be a home run. So there was a lot of computer luck to the game. But the best part, going back to my voice thing, is that anytime there was an out, the computer umpire would say, "You're out." But it was very digital and had this funky sound. So, Mike, you're going to have to edit in. So when you hit
I listened to it when you showed it to me. It goes, "You're out."
Yeah. So when you hear that sound, that's what it sounds like every time you make an out. So great times. It was such a fun game. So pure, so simple. But it's just two people going at it. Me and Jim mastered the controls. Who would be better and a little bit luckier that day. Total competition. Loved it.
Cool. All right, the number 4 on my list. This is really an homage to the Commodore 64. There were a number of games that were great on there, and I'm going to talk a little more specifically about one. But whenever we go to Wenatchee, my Uncle Lance, he was the computer tech guy in the family as far as he really liked to get the stuff at home. My dad taught it, but my uncle had it at home. And Uncle Lance got the Commodore 64. And so whenever we go to Wenatchee, he had all kinds of games for it, and he would let me go up there all weekend long and play. It was great. I just lost myself in that room, and I played all the games he had collected. And the best one he collected was called Jumpman. And there were 2 versions. There was Jumpman and Jumpman Jr. So a little bit of backstory. Jumpman was created by Randy Glover. He was inspired after he saw a Donkey Kong arcade machine at his local Pizza Hut. According to the story, this is and I always laugh when I read about these stories of these games, Norb, that they were really just stick figures doing very, simple things on a low resolution computer screen. But the story is the base on Jupiter has been sabotaged by terrorists who have placed bombs throughout the base's 3 buildings. The object of the game is to defuse all the bombs in a platform film screen. I didn't even know that at the time. All I knew is you had to touch these little circular dots, and when you touched all the dots, you'd move to the next level. And what was cool about Jumpman, it was a similar platform with ladders, but every level was different. So some had robots that would chase you, some had birds that would fly after you. But again, I talked about this on previous shows. I always wanted to get to that next level to see what the new surprises that were waiting for me. And I worked really hard at that. But he had another game that I think you've heard of this, Norb, but it was called Dr. J versus Larry Bird, one-on-one.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
And do you remember the big thing about that game? It was a basketball, so you were Dr. J versus Larry Bird on a half-court basketball match. And it was typical, you'd dribble, jump around, shoot. But if you got close enough, you could stuff the ball, and then once in a while, the back glass would shatter.
Oh, okay.
And that's because Dr. J really shattered the back glass in a game. It was a famous moment in a game where he shattered the back glass. I think that's what created breakaway rims.
Right.
Is because of that. So in the game, once in a while, you'd kind of do a stuff, and the whole glass would go, and it all just fall. And it was like, yeah, I shattered the back glass.
That's cool.
That was its own type of score, even though you didn't get points for it. It was just exciting.
Yeah.
So, did you ever play that?
No, I heard about it, never played it, not even once. I don't even think I ever saw the screen, so I didn't even know about the breaking glass thing. But Dr. J, Julius Erving of the Sixers, and Larry Bird of the Celtics. I mean, that was an epic matchup back then. And what was that? That was in the 80s, right? It was early 80s or something, I think, during those years. But
yeah, late 70s, early 80s.
Yep. No, that's cool. I remember speaking of the breaking backboards, I think there was another basketball player, I think it was Daryl Dawkins, and I think he was with the 76ers also. I can't remember exactly which team he was, but he broke a bunch of them. But yeah, I think the combination of Dr. J and him eventually led to that advent of, the rims that would kind of collapse down so they would stop breaking those things. But it's pretty cool when it happened. I wish I could have seen one in person to see that big old glass shatter. That would have been awesome.
Yeah, it was fun. And he had a game called Beachhead. That was really fun. And another game called Fort Apocalypse, which you were a helicopter invading a base. And I like that because you would try to get further into the base and there'd be new rooms, new traps. I always liked when there was a game of mystery where you had to move into further levels where there's new surprises await you. I think it was just that sense of you felt like you were advancing somewhere. Those games always appealed to me. I think more than sports games. And maybe it's because I played by myself most of the time.
Right.
Sports games were just not fun when you play the computer. Just wasn't fun.
You can't trash talk the computer.
No.
I got you, man, in your face.
Yep.
Not the same when the other person can't react to it. Oh, that's cool.
All right. That's my number 4.
So I guess you're going from 1 to 5. I guess I was kind of going 5 to 1, but this would be my second to last one on my list. And this is a game that's very special, a very special time for me and Rob. And this is one of the coolest games ever. Very underrated game called Starflight, or as we used to call it, Starflit. And this was a game that it was one of the very first PCs that I had. I remember it was senior year when I had this game. And I think it was the only PC game I had, but it was made by Electronic Arts. And I need to read the official description of this because it's a very cool game. Starflight is a space exploration, combat, and trading role-playing video game created by Binary Systems and published by Electronic Arts in 1986. Originally developed for IBM PC, it was later ported to the Amiga, Atari ST, Macintosh, and Commodore 64, and then later revamped for the Sega Genesis in 91. So here's the premise. It's set in the year 4620. The game puts players in the role of a starship captain sent to explore the galaxy. There is no set path, allowing players to switch freely between mining, ship-to-ship combat, and alien diplomacy. The broader plot of the game emerges slowly as the player discovers that an ancient race of beings is causing stars to flare and destroy all living creatures. So this game was amazing to me because I had never played a game where there was this kind of ongoing mission and scope beyond just the beginning and the end and it's over.
It was deep.
It was deep. And this game was one where you had, I think it was one of the first, I don't know, quote me on that, but for me, it was one of the first sandbox games where you could really just do what you wanted. You start out at this base and you're a captain of a starship, and it was your job to decide where you want to go. And you got to build your own crew. You could name them. So you needed to have a medical officer, a first officer, a navigator. So you had to have all these different things. And you could do them from alien races. They could be human. And you got to build up your starship. And you needed to get money to buy cool stuff. So you had to go out to different planets, mine all kinds of elements, come back, buy stuff, upgrade your ship, and go out again. The whole goal was very Star Trek. What's that show? We're off in outer space. Star Blazers. Because the Earth was in trouble, you needed to find colonizable planets that you could go to because Earth's days were numbered. And so the amazing thing about this game was that we would go on for just, it never ended. It was like days and days. And to be honest, we never finished the game. And we played this thing for weeks on end. And it was just so fun to go out and explore strange new worlds, seek out new life and new civilizations. You literally were Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock. And so I would man the controls. Rob would be by me. He wouldn't really do much with the controls, but he'd just be by my side. I'd say, where do you want to go, Rob? Oh, let's go to that place. And it came with this big old poster. You had this poster with the star map on it. So it had where your galaxy was and this really huge galaxy of planets in all ranges. So you had this gigantic map. And to get to places, you had to have enough fuel. So there's a lot of things to figure out. And along the way, you would run into aliens and you have to decide if you're going to be nice to them or if you fight. And if you fight, you better have the weaponry. And so you'd have these conversations with aliens and determine what kind of attitude you'd have. And so there was so many nights in our senior year of playing this game And I remember part of what was unique about it too is that you could install it on any computer, but you had to have the special decoder wheel. Because in order to launch your ship, you had to basically line up this 3-leveled decoder wheel that had holes and slots in it. So it would say, enter the code for wee green bauble, something else, and something else. And then when you lined it up, it would give a code number. And then, so Rob's job was to always decode that. And I remember one night we played till like 4 a.m. and I said, okay, Rob, what's the code for this, this, and this? Rob, what's the code? I turned around, he's got the wheel, and he's like, dead asleep because we'd been playing for so long. But it was just so much fun, and I'd just never been to a game where you just had so many different options to go to just different worlds. And I remember we tried to attack an alien planet. We were going to try to destroy a planet, wipe out entire civilization. We failed miserably, but I remember we had one of our characters' names, one of our crew, his name was Paul. Don't ask me where it came from. It's kind of a movie we shouldn't talk about. But his name was Paul. And I remember one of the most scary sights was we were in the middle of this battle, and then it says, just in our show update, Paul is dead. Me and Rob were like, Paul is dead. It was just so bleak and terrifying. And so it went on, and sadly, the reason we stopped playing was summer was over, and we had to go to college. And we didn't finish the game, and we never got to go back and finish it. So unfortunately, we never got to the end of it. But it was such a great memory of late nights of exploring and playing that game. And it's been a long story, but I got to put one more in there. So we had another friend who wanted to borrow the game, and we let him borrow it. He copied it onto his computer, and we let him borrow the disc. And we just thought he was going to borrow it for a couple days, but he ended up having it for longer. And me and Rob were having Starflight. We called it Starflight. We were having withdrawals. We wanted to play, and so we were determined to get that disc back. So we staked out his house and waited for him to come out, and he wasn't home. We went to the door, and his sister answered. We know he's in there playing Starflight. We want our disc back. We were crazy, stalking this guy's house, and eventually we got it back. But I mean, we were on a mission. We were so addicted. We could not be away from this game. We had to go hunt the disc down. But that's just what that game did to us, because you had to have the disc. There's no way you could play it without that special disc. So that's a great game. I wish there was some way to replay that game again, but it was really cool at the time. I'd never seen anything like that. Starflight, baby.
Now I've cataloged in my head Starflit, Cinnabud, and a Carhead. Yeah. Are there any others?
There might be. Those are the only ones that come to mind. Yeah, me and Rob, the regular names never cut the
more fun.
Never cut it. I always had to change it. So, Starflit, that was the game. Yeah,
so the last on my list, which is not the least by any means, I wasn't numbering these in order of I have a number one. They're really just 5 games. Okay. But I wanted to jump ahead a little bit to the Sega Genesis console in 92. So in 1992, I graduated from the UW, and I'd moved to North Carolina to be with a girlfriend at the time. And the relationship didn't work out. And when I was kind of during my breakup time, I was a pretty lonely guy, and some friends of mine had lent me their Genesis. At that point, I still couldn't afford my own console. It was just funny. I don't know why. I felt like I couldn't justify spending them. I mean, a Genesis was $200-300, and then you had to buy games. And
$40, yeah.
Yeah, that's why a lot of the video rental stores rented consoles. And so these friends lent me their Genesis for a couple weeks. And so I went to the video rental store to rent some games. And the lady working there, I said, what do you recommend, because when you rented, you got it for a long weekend, then you had to return it. So you picked it up on a Friday and had to return it on a Monday. And she suggested a game called Flashback: The Quest for Identity. And it was this game was directed, written, designed, and partially programmed by Paul Cuisset. I probably mispronounced that. But I want you to listen to this very carefully. This is the synopsis of the story. You play as Conrad B. Hart. After his memory was erased, Conrad is chased by mutants and crash lands his hoverbike in a jungle on Titan. He finds a hollow cube which fell from his pocket. It contains a recorded message from himself telling him to meet his friend Ian in New Washington. Does that ring a bell? That kind of a storyline? I'm going to repeat. His memory's erased. He finds a recording of himself telling him to meet a friend. What does that sound like?
Total Recall?
Absolutely. That's totally Total Recall. They ripped it off.
Wait. So, no, I got to get the years straight because this was supposed to be an 80s show, 80s home games.
No. This is a 1992 game.
Okay.
On the Sega Genesis.
Yeah. Okay.
So Total Recall came out
we got
just
out of the
before
80s
that.
for a second. Okay. So,
yes, we did.
But that aside, and Total Recall came out in 90, didn't it?
Yes.
So the game ripped off Total Recall.
Yeah.
Totally. Okay. I got you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I know I moved slightly into the 90s, but it's simply because I had a good story about how I played the snot out of that game over the weekend, and I couldn't beat it. I got to and it was such a mix of Total Recall and Aliens. I mean, the people who made this game, they poured all that pop culture from all the movies we'd been watching into this story. It was...
Get your ass to Mars.
Yeah, definitely not original.
Get your ass to Mars.
But I played it like crazy because I had to return the game Monday, and I couldn't beat it. I got to the final stages, and this alien slug kept slithering around the screen, and I had to somehow shoot it. I couldn't do it, and to this day, I've never beat that game. But it was a really great game, and besides the fact they ripped off some storylines from movies, the graphics were really something, and the way the guy moved around, they used real video capture of people walking and jumping, and then copied that into the pixels of the game. So had to just share that Genesis game because it had a good story, and when it comes to console games, which was the story, of our show, I never really owned a console.
Yeah, right.
So I had to pull from the Apple II, and I had to pull a little bit from the early 90s because I at least had a borrowed console that I played a game on. Really, the first console I ever purchased was the Nintendo 64. First time I ever bought one. So we'll talk about that in another show.
Yeah. All right, well, I guess that brings me to the last game on my list, and that would be the Intellivision game called Sea Battle. And this one was up, Starflight, Sea Battle were right up there, totally different games. But I think why I like this one the most is just because when it comes to my buddy Jim, who I was talking about, how we were pretty close, but, football, I think I edged him a little bit. Baseball, we were pretty much neck and neck. I owned you, Jim, on Sea Battle. You could not beat me and my PT boats and submarines, baby. So in this game, it's has to be a two-player game. And you got one base in the bottom left corner and another base in the right corner. And both players have a fleet of ships. And the goal is to get your aircraft carrier or your troop transport into the other person's base. Once you did that, you get this little music, and you win. So you spend this entire time mapping out your strategy. You got all these islands and little channels to navigate, and you have to determine, what you're going to send in. You're going to go with a big battleship. You're going to bring in a destroyer, a little PT or a sub, and you only have certain numbers of these ships. You have to be very smart with managing your fleet. And along the way, you could bring out your minesweeper or mine layer and lay little mines around the place and try to trap them into getting blown up. So, and you also have mine sweepers where you can sweep the mines where you think there might be a mine waiting for you, or where somebody let one in, you got to get rid of it. So there's a lot of strategy involved, and Jim loves strategy games. He was always talking about he loves to play Stratego and all those stupid war games that I never played.
War games.
Chess, things that he's really good at. So he fancies himself a strategy guy. So there's some strategy involved with this, but no matter what strategy he tried to employ, he could not beat me. So this was such a fun game, and probably the most times I got to see Jim get upset because I would always beat him. Frustrated because the way it would work with, I mentioned submarines and PT boats. So most of the ships fired with guns, and you set your aimer, you try to aim at the other guy, and then they shoot these bullets. When you miss, it makes a splash sound. Good sound effects. Well, this PT boats and the submarines had torpedoes, and the way it works is you set your aimer beyond the person, you try to get that torpedo to hit, the ship. So I just became really good at dodging Wim's bullets and setting those torpedoes just in line to a point where he couldn't get away. Or I'd force him to, crash into the ground, because the islands, you have to navigate the islands, because if your ship runs aground, your ship will sink. So I owned him. That was so much fun, and I think I had more fun beating him on that game than any other game. So lots of fun. It took a long time, like most of these Intellivision games. Everything was a very slow process, but it was a lot of fun. Just a lot of strategy, a lot of combat. But at the end of a long session, I would usually always come out on top. So if I have to dedicate a show, this goes to my buddy Wimskin is his nickname. But had many times of beating him on that game, and I will always be able to take that with me and say, I'll always be better than you.
I could clearly tell that you really are enjoying talking about how you were better at him over this one game, when clearly he must have been better than you over all the others.
Well, not all the others, but when it came to like Sega Genesis and years later, we'll probably have a show devoted to those games. But yeah, he had this. He learned to run the fake field goal to where I couldn't stop it. Yeah. And he could just win by just running fake field goals all game, which completely takes out the fun of trying to play a real football game. And that was very frustrating. But when it came to the Intellivision days, this was probably my crown jewel in games, in terms of, if I need to beat Jim, this is the game we'd play. And he would always play, because I think he always would hope he could beat me. And maybe once in a while he did, but for the most part I dominated. So Jim, this memory's for you. Good stuff. I miss the Intellivision days. That was just a time that you just can't get it back. Even if you had an Intellivision, they have Intellivision emulators. I could get that game, but we're so past what that period was. You couldn't just do it again and recreate that experience. You know what I mean? It just wouldn't be the same. So you just have to go back and remember what it was like when that was the game. That was what you were playing at the time. And the memories will live on forever. So
it's interesting listening to you, because all your memories, every single one of them, is about sharing it with someone else. And that's definitely the major difference between you and I and our childhoods, is all mine are just, I remember playing them on my own.
Well, and what's different now is that even in this current state we're right now, where people really can't get together as much as they want, that doesn't affect it, because of technology and internet and Discord and all kinds of ability to talk while you're gaming, you can be by yourself, but not really be by yourself, and still share in that community. I know your boys play a lot of video games, and half the fun is playing and connecting with other people online. So this is before the days of online, where if that was you then, and they had the technology, you wouldn't have been alone. You would have been able to have some kind of interaction with people, even if you were physically by yourself. But back then, we didn't have that, and so I was fortunate that my folks gave me the joy of the Intellivision to play with friends, and that friends had Atari consoles that I could go over and play with, because we had a lot of times spent. But
and the other big difference I can hear talking with you is, I think back to my neighborhood. I had one neighbor kid that had an Atari 2600, but the problem was he had two brothers. And so he had built-in playmates. And so again, they would play those games all the time. But by the time I got to come over and play it, they were done for the day. But you just had a sister who she wasn't quite the video game partner. So I think in a way it was perfect for you that your friends would come over, because you could all play together. And in my case, the one neighbor, they had brothers. So it was,
No, our lives, late elementary and junior high, were consisted of two things consistently. We were either A, playing video games, or B, making movies. That was our life. If we weren't doing sports after school, we were doing one of those two things. And it's kind of led into doing what we're doing today. So I do think back, and a lot of those guys I'm still friends with today. So it's nice that we not only have the memories, but still connected with Jim. I still see Jim, and I still see Rob. So the guys I'm talking about in this show are guys that we are all together now, friends, even all these years later, 30, 40 years almost years later. So it's, it was Yeah, it was definitely different. If you had grown up on my block, you would have been right in that circle, and eventually we did. Eventually we had our 90s connection after you came back from your stint in North Carolina, and then things did actually, video games brought us together before our friendship, then eventually this, doing this production business together. So video games can bring people together, mom and dads out there. Yeah. There is a positive aspect to it.
I think definitely the social aspect is good. I don't have an honorable mention on my list. I had to reach a little bit just to find the games from the Apple II. There were others like Star Blazer, Sneakers, Taxman that I played on the Apple II. But I do have a dishonorable mention, and really this dishonorable mention is something I think we can both talk about. But to me, it represents the worst of that time, which was Atari, when Atari released Pac-Man for the 2600. That to me represented the worst you could do, and talk about how to bring something down from what everyone wanted. I mean, everyone wanted Pac-Man to be able to play Pac-Man at home. But when Atari delivered it, they ruined it.
That was not even close. Not even close.
Yeah, instead of dots, he eats wafers. And it just, I remember my friends got it. And they kept saying they were going to get it. And I went over to their house. And I remember, I was like, Pac-Man at home. And again, when he's eating the wafers, bang, 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 bang. And then when he dies, and it was just, the ghosts had no personality. They flickered. It was terrible. Yeah,
nothing looked anything like the original, because everything in the Pac-Man is black background, yellow guy, the colored ghost, and the maze was blue. This whole thing, wasn't the whole thing kind of bluish gray?
Yeah.
The Pac-Man didn't even look like Pac-Man. It was always the same direction. It moved like this. It never went up. It didn't face the direction it was eating. I think it just stayed in the same direction. Yeah, everything about it was like, what is this? Yeah, it was terrible. I was thinking, how can they mess it up so bad?
In the arcade game, when you hit the Energizer, the ghost turned blue, and there's that, and in the Atari version, you eat the Energizer wafer, and the ghosts, instead of turning blue, they just get more fainter. But there's no sound. The sound doesn't change. It's like the only way you even know they're blue is if they're just faded. It was... Even the sound package of that game, it was, and I think what made Pac-Man so great was the sounds. The everything from the eating of the dots to the woo, woo, woo.
Yeah.
It was a very, very heightened, exciting game. And the Atari version, it was a letdown. The sound was terrible. I think it was probably one of those things where it was rushed. And yes, they had limitations of what they could do, but I'm sure it was rushed to the market just because they knew they had a cash cow sitting on their hands. But people hated that game. And you had to spend $60, I think, to buy that back then. I remember it was a very expensive game, but
it definitely started that feeling where the arcade experience was not easily replicated at home, at least in terms of creating games that looked like what you wanted to see when you were at the arcade. They could not do it. I don't know if that was just really the limitations of the equipment or what, but I mean, that was the epitome of the worst, biggest letdown of all time, anticipating that game, because we all knew what Pac-Man was all about, and this was nothing like Pac-Man. This was a Pac-Man anti-nightmare, something out of hell. But yeah, that was I'm glad I didn't spend any money to get that thing. It's terrible.
And of course after that, that was the letdown, and then E.T. just nailed the lid on the coffin. It's well known, the story of that E.T. was rushed to the market even faster. And it was a complete disaster, to where Atari destroyed cartridges of the game because they were sitting on them, and it's well documented. I don't need to get into it, but the downside of that time was, you look back, and of course Activision made these awesome games for the 2600. They made the Atari 2600 games look terrible.
Yeah.
So you get the right programmers and the right creativity, they could do amazing things. But then you get into programmers being pushed by business people who just want to get the games out so they can sell them and make money. Then the creativity gets scrapped, and you end up with a bad game.
Yep.
And that was definitely the side of that time when you look back and think, oh, that Pac-Man, that was the beginning. Or that was the biggest letdown.
Well, on the flip side, this is kind of a twofold honorable mention, but the the one computer system that kind of really rewrote that whole experience was when the Nintendo family computer came out. And this is when I was in Japan in 1985. It came out, it was this white system, very small, with kind of red on it. And I remember telling Rob and friends back home, I said, you gotta see this thing. This is amazing. It looks just like the arcade. And it was called the family computer, and they'd never heard of it. And I was like, what is that? And I was like, what are you talking about? I was like, it's this brand new thing. Well, it would eventually become released in a totally different package known as the Nintendo 64. Or no, not 64, the Super Nintendo. But they changed it, repackaged it, and changed the name to Super Nintendo.
I think it was the Nintendo Entertainment System, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to the later
correct
NES, Nintendo Entertainment System. But that was the family computer to start off with. And it was amazing. And that ties into my honorable mention game was Ikari Warriors. I've talked about this in our 80s, favorite 80s games, but they did release a version of Ikari Warriors on Nintendo. And again, this was a game that after Starflight was over, but Rob and I were still friends. Every once in a while, he would come up to spend the night at our bachelor pad up in Seattle. And he'd bring his Nintendo and we would play Ikari Warriors. And what was great about that game is they did a decent job of simulating what it looked like in the arcade version. But because that was a quarter sucker, it was nice that you had the cheat code ABBA and you could keep the game going. We were able to actually play for several hours and get to the end of the Ikari Warriors game and finish it. And that was a fun time. Definitely represented 1987. I want to say it was the fall of 87 because it was first year of college, and a few nights of Rob coming over and bringing that game over. It was fun to be able to feel like we conquered it. We couldn't finish Starfleet, but we finished Ikari Warriors, Ikarhead. So that was another post-high school but early college experience where we got to get at least one more bit of our 80s arcade, nostalgia out of our system, was able to conquer the game. So that's my honorable mention. And probably the last of the 80s. I think that kind of represented the end of the 80s, our console games, because after that, it became the 90s, and then we got into the Sega Genesis, and then the PC first-person shooters, and that was a whole new world. But that definitely, the Ikari Warriors and Super Nintendo kind of ended the era for us in terms of the 80s before the 90s came ushering in. But a great time. Never get tired of talking about the 80s. So many good memories. And
for the surprise, I needed something to hold, and all those games I talked about in the Apple II days, I don't have any of the boxes from them or anything. I have a nice slideshow playing back here, which you'll see a lot of box art from that time. So I wanted to have something at least, and I came up with the game Flashback for the Nintendo Switch, where they redid. It's the exact same game. They slightly updated the graphics, but it's an homage to that game that I played back in '92 over that long weekend. And I just thought I would share that it's neat to see these games have a new life in collector's editions on modern consoles, so you can still enjoy them. There's ways to play these games easily on Steam, and they have companies that make new versions of the consoles. There's so many cool things out there that are ways to enjoy these games. The tricky part is getting the kids to enjoy them, because my boys, these games were too hard. It's like they don't have the patience. The games today, they're much more friendly and easier on people. They're nice to you. Back then, they were brutal. You had to really work at it, and it's just not like that now. You'd have to invest time to get good at it. And now if you want to introduce your kids to a new game, they're just going to have a mild curiosity about it, because obviously compared to anything now, it's going to look like crap, right? So you just have to kind of go, oh, wow, look at this. But they're not going to want to spend more than 5-10 minutes probably. And if they get frustrated and get killed too easy, they'll be done. Whereas you and I had to spend days and days mastering the techniques to get to a point where you could really milk the enjoyment out of a game, because you get introduced to a game and then you got to learn it. And then once you get past the learning and you can really just play, then you're really enjoying the game. But if you can't get past that sort of learning struggle part, it's not going to be very rewarding. And that's the problem, is trying to get kids now, introducing them to these games, which there's a lot better games for them to play than this
old bad graphics game. So
well, what's
I
funny
think
though,
that's
Norb, is
challenging.
I don't think you see this as much as I do, but there's a term. It's called 8-bit, and it's a term to describe a pixel look for a game. But there's actually a lot of games made today that have the 8-bit look, because I've seen my boys play them.
Well, I think of Minecraft comes to mind, right?
Minecraft is Minecraft is kind of like that. Of course, it's 3D.
Blocky, but it's 3D.
It's 3D, but these are 2D, 8-bit looking games, and the kids like that look. I think it's retro and it's got a cool look. The funny part to me is with my boys, at one point I says, I want you to play a real 8-bit game, and so I again want to play one of the real 8-bit games, and they can't do it. It's too hard.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's that patience, that what do you call it? That short attention span also applies to the patience level. If you can't get it within 5 minutes, probably you're not going to spend any more time trying to figure it out. So, Yep.
All right. That's all I got.
All right. Well, that was fun. It's always great to take trips down memory lane. But before we say goodbye, I do want to say once again to thank all of you who are watching the show here on YouTube. Please continue to do so and be a subscriber. Hit that like button and the bell. And it always helps us grow our channel and our broadcast. And for those of you who are listening on the podcast, we appreciate your loyalty. The fact that you're listening right this very second means you made it through a very long show of us talking about the 80s, and it was interesting enough for you to stick around to this point. So thank you for doing that, and hopefully you'll continue to tune in the future. I'm Norb.
And I'm Mike, and I also just want to add too that we appreciate all you podcast listeners. And Norb, we've been monitoring where people are listening to our show, and since day one, there's someone in France who either listens to every show, or perhaps you're just a bot downloading our show. But I'd like to know who you are, if you are a real person, and how you found us and why you're listening. Send us an email to thewatchmenshow@gmail.com. That's our official show email. Send us an email. Let us know who you are and why you like listening to us, if you truly are a person in France, because you listen to every single one.
Yeah, I know. I'm dying to know too.
Yeah.
Do you even understand, do you speak English? And how did you get connected to us being all the way in France? But really, this applies to any of you who are watching or listening. If you want to send us an email to let us know how we're doing, how we can improve our show, or if you have other ideas you'd like us to talk about, we'd love to hear from you, because we're still growing our show right now. And while I feel like it's still in the infancy level and it's still, still in the bottom level right now as we're trying to get it out there, it always helps to know that people are out there listening, and we'd love to hear from you. So yes, please send us an email if you feel so inspired to do so.
So we appreciate it. And with that, I'm Mike. Thanks for watching.
Yep.
And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching The Watchmen.
Please click on here to watch other episodes, and be sure to hit that like button too.
And please subscribe and hit that notification bell. That way you'll always be alerted to any future episodes.
It really helps us out, and we appreciate it.
We'll see you next time. And remember, we'll be watching.